Sprinkel, let me ask you this question based on your review of all the information you've kind of described here today. As it relates to times for when a 911 call was placed, times as it relates to, I guess, found within call detail records, and then times like the one you just referenced in the video surveillance for the Texaco. Can you tell the jurors, I guess, through your investigation, how you compared, I guess, times from the video surveillance to things like the 911 call and call detail records?
Well, your call detail records, that's the times in those are going to be pretty consistent with, the atomic clock.
Why is that?
Well, they're a cell phone provider, and they're computerized records, and they're just going to be synced up because they're on a computer system with like an internet time protocol, or which is synced up with the atomic clock. So that's a good gauge as to the exact time of something. Also, the 911 call, system. I found in my experience that 911 calls, the timestamps on those are accurate. Surveillance videos can be a little less so, but what I found here was that knowing when the 911 call was placed, comparing all of that with cell phone records and tower logs and all that, when comparing, for example, the 911 call to surveillance video from the Texaco in particular, you can see the events that are consistent with the shooting on the Texaco footage. People ran inside the store, if I remember correctly. I do remember correctly, they did. And from that, you can place a pretty good timestamp or time when the drive-by shooting occurred.
Would it be your testimony today that all of the times are, I guess, synced up exact as it relates to each other? For example, the call detail records and the Texaco video surveillance.
No, I can't say that they're linked up exactly. Okay. Surveillance videos, it's not uncommon for them to be a minute or two long.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last.
Can you speak into the mic?
It's not uncommon for surveillance videos to be a minute or two off. So I can't say that basically the watches of the surveillance video and the cell phone records were synchronized.
Okay. And we talked earlier a little bit about the phone records, or the additional phone records that you reviewed. For example, Justin Cobb and Mr. McMullins. Do you remember that?
I do.
And can you tell the jurors, upon receiving those records, however which way they were requested, did you utilize, I guess, reviewing those records as it relates to the things that we've described previously here today, the video surveillance as well as the statements of both Mr. Zachary and Mr. Copeland?
Yes.
And I want to draw your attention specifically to the time period roughly 7:29 p.m. All the way, I guess, 10 minutes to 7:39 p.m. So that 10-minute period, okay?
Okay.
Can you tell the jurors, in your review of that activity, was there any activity as it relates to the handset associated with Mr. McMullins and the handset associated with Jeffrey Williams?
Your Honor, this is
Cumulative. Agent Bernie already testified to all this.
Sustained.
Well, let me ask you this. As it relates to your review of the call detail records, specifically the call logs of between Mr. Williams and Mr. Treadwell, can you tell the jury how many incoming and outgoing calls there were between Mr. Treadwell and Mr. Williams?
About the same objection.
Sustained.
The specific number of calls between Mr. Treadwell and Mr. Williams, I don't believe was ever discussed.
Pretty sure it was.
All right, I'll ask you this question. As it related to your review of the call detail records for Mr. Copeland, okay? Did you, during that time period of 7:29 to 7:39 p.m., locate any calls, whether it be incoming or outgoing, between Mr. Copeland and Mr. Williams?
7:29 to 7:39.
Correct.
If I may look at the logs. No, my short answer is I don't believe so. And that remains my answers on reviewing the actual phone logs. There were no calls between Mr. Copeland and Mr. Williams. That would have been in the phone logs from the company. Again, during Mr. Copeland's statement, he said he called Mr. Williams earlier that evening on FaceTime. FaceTime calls are not going to appear in phone records from the phone company.
Okay. But from your review, is it your testimony you didn't see any calls between Mr. Copeland and Mr. Williams?
That's right.
How about as it relates to Mr. Copeland and Mr. Bradford, Mr. Cobb, Mr. McMullins, or Mr. Treadwell?
Not that I found, no.
Okay, and I'd ask you the same series of questions as it relates to Quindarious Zachary. Did you see any activity on Mr. Zachary's records between Mr. Williams, Mr. Bradford, Mr. Cobb, Mr. McMullins, and Mr. Treadwell?
All right, well, I'm reviewing, and I'm looking at his records right now, too, just to make sure I'm not mistaken. What were the names that you just gave me again?
Mr. Williams, did you see any activity as it relates to Mr. Zachary and Mr. Williams?
I do not.
And between Mr. Zachary and Mr. Bradford and Mr. Cobb?
I do not.
And were there any, I guess, incoming or outgoing calls between Mr. Zachary and Mr. McMullins or Mr. Treadwell?
Not that I see, no.
Okay. And I want to ask you lastly about Mr. Antonio Sledge. In your review of his call detail records, did you see any incoming or outgoing calls between Mr. Sledge and Mr. Williams between the time period of 7:29 p.m. to 7:39 p.m.?
No, I don't see any.
And what about between Mr. Sledge and Mr. Bradford or Mr. Cobb?
Between what time frame again?
7:29 and 7:39 p.m.
Justin Cobb called Javaris Bradford at 7:31 p.m.
And I'm sorry, I need to be more clear. Did you see any, was there any incoming or outgoing calls between Mr. Zachary and Mr. Bradford?
I'm reviewing Mr. Zachary's records. I do not see any.
And in your review of Mr. Zachary records, did you see any incoming or outgoing calls between Mr. Zachary and Mr. McMullen?
No, I don't see any.
And lastly, for that same time period, did you see any activity, whether it be incoming or outgoing calls between Mr. Zachary and Mr. Treadwell?
No, I don't see any.
And when you're reviewing Mr. Zachary's records, which are contained in State's Exhibit 517Y, is that correct? Is that correct? Is the records contained for Mr. Zachary, do you recall those being 517Y?
I don't know the exhibit number for the records.
Further questions pending redirect.